there's very few system change opportunities that are available to us. And I think we're living in one right now. There's like a huge technological, economic, social movement towards low carbon transition and chance basically to redesign the system. And one of the key things that we should hold in our hands is the fact that we can redesign it to make it less unfair. And we've seen growing inequality for a very long time. And this is a chance to kind of put a fork in the road and say, let's go this way instead.
I'm Carolyn Parrs, clean tech communicator, coach, and host of Just Power, a podcast about creating a just transition to a clean energy future that leaves no one behind. If affordable, reliable, clean energy that benefits everyone is important to you, you're in the right place, my friend. We have the power to make that happen, and that's what's happening each week on the Just Power podcast. Welcome to Just Power. Today we're diving into a groundbreaking new approach to just transitions, one that's not just shaping corporations but entire countries. Scotland has launched a world-first framework to track and measure the success of just transitions, and it's already sparking conversations well beyond its borders. And joining me today from the UK is Dr. David Drabble. He is the lead researcher and co-author of this report. He has over 16 years in European policy research, and his latest work, which is this we'll be talking about today, has been hailed by the Scottish government as, quote, world-class and a world-leading framework. Hello, David. Welcome
Hi,
from the
Caroline.
UK.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. It's a lot later here than it is where you are, but
I
excited
know.
to get
I'm
diving
so
into
happy.
this.
I hope it's not too late for you. I promise you can get to bed right after this.
Okay, I'll hold you to that. Thanks.
So, well, first I wanted to say congratulations on working on a project of this caliber, having an influence on an entire country, right?
Yeah.
With the framework that you've worked on. So well done. Well done. How did that
Thanks a
feel?
lot.
What did that feel like to, I just find that I've worked on some with corporations, but
Mm-hmm.
really creating methodologies and metrics for a country, right?
Yeah.
How did that happen for you?
It was serendipitous, really. I mean, the project was very interesting from the start, and we bid for it with the University of Edinburgh, who one of the sort of world leading academics on just transitions, Dr. Kirsten Jenkins, just to bring her in early. So it was a really interesting project because it was, like you say, a national level. We started off thinking about whether to do it as sectoral because it kind of makes sense. There's a lot of work done on energy in particular, but we kind of broadened out from the beginning and tried to keep that sort of national ambition throughout. And over 6 months, thousands of conversations and lots of thinking and discussion that we got there in the end, and we're quite happy with the result, really. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. So how did let's just start maybe a little, back up a little bit. How did climate justice focus, I should say, start for you?
Well, I mean, I've always had a passion for working on climate change. We didn't do a lot on climate change for a long time. So just to give some context, work at the Tavistock Institute, which is a pretty sort of venerable post-war social science organization. So we did a lot in the past around things like coal mining and also sort of socio-ecological work, which kind of looks at systems in a sort of wider way. But we hadn't done a lot of work in the environment. And there was a lot of people in the organization who were getting more and more anxious about the environment. And we set up an environment group, which had, I think, more than half of the organization in, which is like a kind of sign of how much people were worried about it. And I kind of emerged as one of the sort of leaders of that. And my passion basically was that, we can make our own organization green, but I wanted to do work in this space because as researchers and consultants, we can do a lot more good actually being active in that area. And I've also done a lot of work with excluded communities throughout my career, so particularly in digital exclusion, but also a lot on social exclusion, families from low income backgrounds and that sort of thing. So combining those in this approach, it was really
wow, that sounds like both
nice
pieces to that, right?
exactly.
The climate work and really working with underserved communities, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that was really
Fantastic.
nice, and it sort of triggered something obsessive in me, which is still there. Yeah,
Okay, well, you were born for this then.
obviously. Yeah.
Fantastic. So before I dive into some, I have lots of questions about it,
hmm
about the report, but I want to just ask, because I ask all my guests this, what
hmm
does energy equity, energy justice mean to you?
That's a really interesting question. I think the fact is there's no sort of consensus on it, and for me, it's about safeguarding whilst improving. So I think there's a sort of do no harm principle, do no further harm, that the existing energy system is inequitable. And if you change things, there's a risk that it's going to make it even worse for many communities. So it's, on one hand, it's like a protective thing. And then the other, I think, is more to make the system and policy changes so it isn't stacked against vulnerable people, essentially. And you're future-proofing and making sure that the low-carbon transition is also going to be helping people, particularly those from vulnerable groups. And so I think that this presents a sort of opportunity. There's very few system change opportunities that are available to us, and I think we're living in one right now. There's like a huge technological, economic, social movement towards low carbon transition, and it's a chance basically to redesign the system. And one of the key things that we should hold in our hands is the fact that we can redesign it to make it less unfair. And we've seen growing inequality for a very long time, and this is a chance to kind of put a fork in the road and say, let's go this way instead. Yeah.
You know, I love how you said that, because this is a very auspicious time, right? This is a moment in history that most people don't get to experience, that we can change a systems wide for everyone, right?
Yeah.
And this is it. And there's so many amazing technologies and minds on it. And the social piece, the human side to energy, and the transition is so important with our urgency to speed forward, right? And but also embedding this piece is where the challenge is. But I think we're up for it. Certainly you are. I get that. And so with that, I know that I've admired Scotland from a long time, right? Looking at how you've handled really sustainability in your energy companies, where you are as compared to where we are in the U.S. I was always lusting after going, this is what we can do too. Just saying. But so you have this long-held commitment, right, Scotland, to a just transition and to sustainability. And but when I was doing some research up until this report, many claimed that most of the plans were positioned within policy frameworks as generic, maybe more generic and more or aspirational. And that's all good. But then there's like getting down to the brass tacks, right? On the metrics and measurements. So what's different here with the report that you've worked on?
Totally. I think that's a really good reading of it. We kind of started with these just transition outcomes that the Scottish government had kind of put together, which were very, not to insult anyone, but it was slightly airy. You know, it was very sort of politically worded. You could tell it sort of decided slightly by committee, and they were very hard to measure. And that was our core requirement, really, that we wanted something that you could pin down and you could say, you know, someone's got to be responsible for this. And when the language is not very tight, that doesn't really help you doing that. So that was where we started. It was also another complicating factor. I mean, I'm sure it's similar in the States, but there are a lot of plans. There are a lot of people talking about it. They had a lot of sort of sectoral plans. There was different regions. They all had different ideas. There were sort of pinch points in different parts where there seemed like there's going to be a big transition, and there were some reports on that. And they weren't talking the same language. They were sort of talking about justice in different ways. They were talking about the aims in different ways, and when they were going to reach different things. It was slightly messy, essentially. So
I bet.
Yeah. So a big task was to not forget about that work, and just kind of see whether it could be sort of sewn together, whether there could be some sort of coherence. And we did like a lot of mapping and reading different documents and seeing what everyone was saying about, and then bringing the people who commissioned us together, the Just Transition Commission, and seeing what sense they could make of it. And we had about 4 different workshops to discuss with them and to prioritize and to see what kind of had to be in there, what was nice to have and what wasn't really needed. Yeah.
So you looked at what was already been done, right?
Yeah.
And took that into account.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously you came to, you interviewed many people.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that, how you got input from outside during this process.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was one of the things we kind of insisted on, really, that there'd been a lot of consultation, a lot of research before, but some groups were not really very well represented. And that included people from like the gamekeeping sector, that the people who were sort of stewards of the land, and then the land was often like being bought by big companies to pay carbon credits, just, you know, and then it just became all forested, and that really led to a lot of sort of ecological degradation. And so we wanted to get some sort of outside perspectives where you can really sort of complicate this issue and say it's not just you go green or you don't go green. It's like the way that you do it is really important, and who we talked to kind of reflected that. We kind of did a little mapping in terms of which voices hadn't been heard so strongly, and tried to talk to people in those spaces. So we did about 12 interviews just at the beginning of the project. And also we worked very closely with the client, who's the commission, and they're made up of about 20 people, all from very different backgrounds, different areas of expertise. People from unions, people from like the remote islands, people who are in energy and transport, academics, practitioners. So from that, we kind of use that as a resource that we wanted to really kind of bounce ideas off people. And, you know, you're never going to get agreement in a group like that, but we can kind of persuade people that we're taking an approach which is like is as simple as we can possibly make it, and try not to be too complicated, because that's the way you sort of alienate people, really.
Yeah, simplicity is good. That's it's hard to distill it down, right? So that's admirable for the trying that. So different regions, thinking different regions and different needs for each region, different outcomes, different populations, different weather, different. How did you approach that?
That was really hard. I mean, I'm saying this a lot, but it was very hard to make a framework that was worked at a national level.
Yeah.
And it came from the sort of regional and local and sectoral level. So we sort of pieced together a national picture. But the idea that this could be translated to different scales, essentially. So we've been commissioned for a sort of further piece, which is in Grangemouth, which is it's not very famous in the UK, never mind the US. It's a small town, but it's home of the last oil refinery in Scotland, and it's going to be decommissioned in about 2 months' time. And there's been a lot of talking for a very long time, but very little action.
The last coal mine is being decommissioned in 2 months?
Yeah, the last oil refinery.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a huge win for for the green side because it's responsible for about 7% of emissions in Scotland. But the workers who are there, 400 workers, haven't got any work to go to. There's no real planning for what's going to happen to them next.
This is the just transition, right?
Yeah. So what we try to do is think, okay, we have a sort of framework for Scotland. We have things that we think, are just transition outcomes, what we'd like to see. How does that work at a different scale? I mean, they've got different issues. They're mostly concerned about people's jobs. It's not always about that. It's also about, vulnerable consumers. But in this case, the priority should be on jobs because these people are about to lose their jobs. So we try to translate it in that way to so that you could look at it and find different ways of approaching just transition depending on the scale and the sort of needs of a different area.
Yeah. I can build it. I bet you it's a work in progress. It's got to be, right? It's not one and done, right? That things,
sure.
as you keep on going, as things shift, you're constantly moving with it. So let me ask some specifics now. So at the root of energy justice, right, and equity is ensuring that historically overburdened communities do not get left behind, right? That is like the basis of it. How is Scotland taking just that piece on?
So there's been a lot of work identifying different communities. So, for example, Aberdeenshire, which is like the northeast of Scotland, is home to most of the oil rigs. It's most of the sort of energy companies are based there. And there's been a lot of work locally trying to engage communities. What's been sort of interesting is that there's been a lot of planning, there's been a lot of discussion, but there's not always been much money to actually invest and develop programs. And what the government are interested in is sometimes not necessarily about just transition. So they have a big just transition fund, which was about £500 million over 10 years. And a lot of what's been funded isn't necessarily what you'd say is about just transition. It is investing in new technologies like green hydrogen and sort of testing those out.
Okay.
So I think there's still some work to be done in terms of what a just transition program might look like. There's been some good work in that Aberdeenshire work. So there has been some participatory budgeting, for example, where communities get to vote on some community projects and which should be funded, which is sort of needed most in the community. So there's been quite a lot of innovation in terms of how you go about this and how you talk to communities and how you engage them, but a bit less in terms of actual concrete actions that are going to really help the transition. Yeah.
So the how was really, you dove into the how. Is that documented on how you did it in the report?
Yeah. We went quite a lot into the methodology. I think one thing I'm quite proud of in retrospect was the focus that we had on mechanisms, because it is quite hard to think about, what are the sort of social levers you've got to get from A to B. And I think it was especially difficult for us because there weren't many examples, like I said, of how that does actually work. There's a lot more sort of written about it than there is actually happening on the ground. And there are some good cases that we can sort of draw on. But
any particular cases that stand out for you?
Yeah, so we had a nice one recently in the east of England called Radcliffe-on-Sea. So that was when the last coal-fired power station closed. That was just 2 months ago. And that ended essentially 140 years of coal-powered electricity.
Wow,
which
long
started
time.
in Victorian times. And, the UK, obviously, in the Industrial Revolution was a huge emitter. So that kind of ended that story. But they handled it very nicely. They had 3 unions on site, and they've been negotiating since 2020. And they worked to ensure basically that all 154 workers had work to move into when the plant closed. And
completely 100%.
Yeah,
right.
100%. Yeah. So they were very happy with that result. And it's interesting because I think coal power has really been on the decline in the UK, and sort of worldwide. It's seen as a very dirty fuel. So it's been quite an orderly process. Whereas in other cases, like with Grangemouth, the oil refinery, also with like steel making plants, it's been a lot messier. And so you don't see that kind of the progress in the same way. But in this case, the fact that they engaged really honestly with the unions, they all saw it as a sort of a win-win situation. And they were backed by funding and support for the workers to reskill and find high-quality jobs. That was all seen as like really key in terms of getting the outcome that they wanted.
Yeah, because many times it's generations, right?
Yeah.
Families and generations that have worked in the mines, and it's just part of their culture. And and what do you do about that, right? And there's and moving into clean energy, the jobs are often more high paying, but the problem is, a lot of people might not realize this, is that once the solar array is up or the wind turbines are blowing or going round and round and the wind is blowing, that's it, right? And there's like one guy behind the computer, right? So there's that happens there. We have a lot of expansion to happen, right? For now, but at some point it'll peak.
Yeah, totally. And that's kind of the story that we saw in Grangemouth. We went in January up to do some field work and some sort of ethnographic work and talking to people there. We talked to a librarian who said her grandfather and her father both worked in the sort of oil refinery. They moved in to sort of company housing that BP had set up like 70 years ago. And that was kind of part of their family history. And the fact that it's all closing very suddenly is a huge wrench. And this is the sort of economic dimension, of course, that the factories are going to be closed and there's no real replacement to that. They're going to become sort of derelict sites. But the alternative, there's no sort of oil refinery equivalent, really. I mean, they're talking about green hydrogen, for example, as an alternative that could be a sort of persistent way to get people in a factory, to get people in a building and work.
We're taking that
energy
seriously here too.
Yeah. But it's not clear what the future of that technology is, I think. Yeah.
And actually, it's not clear. I know in the energy companies that, that last 20% to get us to 100% is not clear either. It's still a work in progress that's happening here. So, some more room for innovation and more jobs.
For sure.
So here's a question, right? One of our challenges of just transitions is moving from policy commitments, right, to action. Or worse, sometimes when there's no commitments at all, like a country that I know currently. What is the biggest barriers for Scotland facing implementation?
I think it's a lot about the complexity of it. We had a meeting just last week with the Scottish government, and there were a lot of very senior people there, and just kind of working through the complexities of it. I mean, one of the things we highlighted, I mean, we were being honest in the report that, it's very hard to say nationally who are the vulnerable groups in Scotland. It differs from place to place. If you're in an island that's very remote, that's very big on offshore wind or offshore oil, that's very different to a city centre, situation where you have people who are very vulnerable, but the only connection with energy they really have is in consuming it. So the vulnerabilities really differ depending on where you are, who you're talking to, what changes are being sort of suggested, because people are vulnerable to changes in different ways depending on where they are. So that means there does need to be a lot of planning. And I think in some cases, we've seen sort of bad faith policy in that, it can be used as a brake, essentially, for the low carbon transition, that you can say that, we can't do anything until we're sure that no one is going to be disadvantaged by this. It's going to take years and years to sort out and to really understand which groups are vulnerable. We don't want to make anyone's life any worse. And actually that's never going to be possible. And
Right.
there is an urgency to this. And you do need to make decisions on the fly and with good enough data. It's not going to be perfect. And
That's right.
That's fine. But
Right.
you kind of need to accept that position that we're going to be ignorant and we're going to be making ignorant decisions. And a lot of people aren't happy with that.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that, because a couple of months ago, I read about your cabinet secretary
Mm-hmm.
of net zero and energy, Gillian Martin, said the scale of societal change is needed for 75% reduction in emissions by 2030 would not be fair or just on
Mm-hmm.
the people of our society. It would cause
Yep.
serious impacts across communities and hit our people especially hard. Therefore, we cannot achieve them.
Yep.
It was like gauntlet, it was, and it was very matter of fact. We cannot achieve them.
Yep.
And what you said is something a little different right now.
Yeah.
It's like, we're doing this. It might be messy, and it is
Yep.
going to be messy. Are we going to make mistakes? Yes, we will, but it's happening.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you believe it's achievable?
Yeah, I do. But I think they got in a situation where it became not achievable because they had incredibly ambitious targets for a deadline which was fast approaching. And because they hadn't done the investment and they hadn't been able to sort of match those targets, they preferred to drop the targets completely rather than actually, say we failed to do that.
Got
and
it.
that resulted in, the Green Party left the government coalition. So now they're a minority government. So it was a hugely political situation where they made a decision essentially that the environmental goals aren't achievable. And then you can kind of use a just transition as a sort of shield to justify why they're not doing it. But the fact was that they weren't reaching their green targets. And so they had to give up on them. And so that actually happened at the start of our project, where we began
right at the beginning, huh?
Yeah.
Lucky you.
Yeah, exactly. So we were supposed to be doing these targets to 2030 and then 2040 and 2045. And when we started the project, it was like, forget about that, just 2045. So, but the commission themselves are still very committed to reaching the previous targets. And there's no sort of idea in the Just Transition Commission to slow down the transition to low carbon economy. It's just that when you make decisions, they need to be informed. You need to follow certain processes. You need to follow principles and do everything at once. And that's very hard. That's very hard for a government to do. It's very hard for people in local authorities to do. And it is very hard for companies to put those resources aside to make sure that consultations are kind of not falling through the gaps and actually informing decision making.
So many leaders want to have it all figured out, right? I mean, because their name is on the line, their reputation. But this is such a massive undertaking that there's no way to know how it's all going to, play out, right? So I like what you said there, right? That you're going to do your best shot, right? And you're going to do your homework and make sure every voices are heard throughout this. It's not just a tunnel vision by the government or anyone else. Which brings me to...
I was going to say there's a phrase that we use quite a lot, especially early in the project. We're sort of building the bridge while we're walking on it. We know that this is a work in progress and it's not going to be perfect and it's very unstable, but that's the only way it's going to be possible. You kind of have to live with the imperfections of it.
Building the bridge while we're walking on it. That's really good. I'm going to use that. Thank you for that.
No.
So let me just make a few parallels that I'm seeing right now that with progress and setbacks that between Scotland and let's just say U.S. Our more progressive states, right? We're having some pushback within a changing administration, but people on the ground are moving forward. They're going to make this happen no matter what. So are you seeing any of that in where you are in the UK, let's just say, and how it's being seen?
Yeah, totally. So I think that the dynamic that Scotland has and the other sort of devolved nations of the UK, Wales and Northern Ireland, they have a lot of powers, but they don't have all the powers. There's a lot that isn't within the gift of the Scottish government to grant, even if they agree to everything. They don't have their hands on all the purse strings. It needs to kind of come from the UK government in London as well. And we had an interesting situation with the change of government recently. It's kind of opposite to yours, perhaps, that we had a Conservative government for 14 years and were very sort of climate sceptic. Didn't work with the Scottish government much at all. They would, literally call and they wouldn't be answered, wouldn't reply to emails. And then with the change of administration, the Labour government have been far more collaborative. They've immediately went up to Grangemouth, for example, and it's a bit too little too late, but they promised hundreds of millions in education for people who are working in the oil and gas sector there. So when they're kind of working in concert, it really does help to get outcomes and to actually make progress. And you can do a lot at sort of state level, devolved government level, also, local levels when you have a lot of consensus. But it works far more powerfully when you have all the different scales kind of working together and in some sort of agreement that, something needs to be done. And we do need to safeguard people, and it's within our interest to do that. And that's kind of what we started to see as we've kind of gone through the project.
Yeah, I mean, it is right. We've had in the U.S. billions and billions of dollars flowing in to disadvantaged communities through the Justice 40 monies, and that's being, there's pushback there, and some of it has been dismantled or trying to be dismantled. But an interesting fact is that 85% of the monies I read are in Republican districts. So everyone's benefiting. And it's about everyone, right? It's people are benefiting, and I wonder how that'll play itself out, right? Because pushback happens within a party and outside of a party as well.
Completely.
So doing a little pivot here, how does Scotland plan to track all of this, right, and adapt its strategies over the next, let's say, decade?
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing we propose that's been quite welcomed is a dashboard. So we have indicators and measures for all the different parts of the framework. I talked earlier about the mechanisms, so how you're actually going to get there. We have measures for those, and also for outcomes, which are a little bit easier to track. It's things like lower financial inequality, which is a bit easier than how much you consult and how much decisions are kind of followed through. So we're kind of focusing on the outcomes dashboard, and we're seeing like year to year, are there progress in the key indicators and measures? And we've broken those down into 8 different areas, and those are in 4 sort of bigger categories. One's about inequality and not making sure that inequalities worsen, another around communities, another around jobs and skills, and then on the environment as well. And so we have pretty loose in some ways indicators and measures for each of those areas that can be drilled down to a local level. And essentially, it's like, what's the health of the just transition overall in Scotland? We're able to kind of offer a little bit of a proxy that you can see at a sort of broad level what's improving and what's not. So that's one thing. There's also a lot of
those regions weighing in an ongoing way, right, on this, so that you can ultimately look at it from a holistic standpoint?
That's the ambition, yeah. So I think that's really important, and what we're trying to argue for is not to have these silos, and that this kind of follows. It's sort of embedded at all the different levels that you can think of. One of the things we're suggesting is that all public bodies in Scotland, which include like health services as well as local authorities, they all report on their just transition progress each year. They already do this for climate change and their environmental impact. So we're suggesting they also add, how are you considering vulnerable communities? And if those decisions are made, and they've said that this is possible, then at the different levels, the local levels, regional levels, they will need to sort of by law report on just transition. And that's one step.
Okay.
You can write about it. That's one thing. And then, of course, it's feet on the ground, money invested.
Yeah,
so
that's so important, right?
Yeah,
financing this whole thing, it's not cheap.
No, it's not. No, and I think there are ways to kind of argue that it shouldn't be the priority. That we're in a mini recession. We shouldn't be focusing on just transitions and climate change. We just need to get the economy back working again.
Yeah,
and we just need growth. And I think in that context, it's quite hard to really argue for these things, because a lot of it comes down to very hard to imagine situations around climate change and what might happen in 100 years from now, which elected governments don't really hold in mind. They hold in mind the next 4 years and the next electoral cycle. So we're kind of working in that context, and it is very difficult.
That's true for corporations too. Often, not all, but often, it's the short-term gains. So, which brings me. So, what are some of the lessons, perhaps, for other countries or even corporations? How could they learn from Scotland's approach?
I think one of the main things is to talk. I think to talk to policymakers, to talk to people in the different parts of the landscape, the citizens, but also corporations, unions, education, and just try to follow a holistic approach. I mean, that sounds a bit trite, but the way that we tried to do it was to be quite systematic in, really drilling down what's the kind of scope, what you're actually looking for in terms of a just transition, what level, what's your boundaries, and then to kind of think about the presenting problems, we call it, the sort of context, what is the current situation in terms of social justice, for example, and how can you address that? What are your sort of long-term aims? And just go through it in that way, and to think about, how you might measure that. We've really put a lot of emphasis on measurement, and I was, looking at the latest COP where they reported on just transition, and it was really obvious that there were no sort of agreed measures, and it was very hard to therefore say you're responsible for that in your country, because you don't know what you're measuring against. You're just kind of saying, we want to have a just transition. So, okay, put that into practice. What do you mean by that? How do you break that down?
This is the big difference here with your report. There's measurements, there's mechanisms, there's metrics, so that you say others can take it as a framework. It's a framework, right?
It's a framework,
and be able to, adapt that to their current situation wherever they are.
And we were quite unlucky because there hadn't really been something like this before. I mean, my usual preferred approach is to borrow. You know, you can kind of look at other people and what they've done and
So
kind
you're
of
pioneers
be like a
here.
magpie. Well, I guess so, yeah, but it was very painful, yeah. But I think the result is that we have something that other people can borrow from now, and, you know, be inspired by, hopefully, to just in terms of like mapping what do you want out of this just transition program you're delivering. You know, we have a set of about 50 odd outcomes that you can have a look at and say, you know, that fits, that's completely out of scope, you know. Yeah. And just a way of thinking about what you want to achieve. I think just defining that as clearly as you can is just a real help when you're designing any kind of program.
What do you want to achieve here?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly. And how, you know, being
First
very
the
honest
what,
with yourself.
right?
Yeah.
And then figure out the how.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what they did in LA with 100% renewables. Like the mayor had a vision.
Yeah.
And they're like, how do we do it? And they modeled it out, right?
Yeah.
Did a few scenarios, and then they figured it out.
Yeah.
With the help of our national lab and another University of Berkeley, I believe, California.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And it is possible. It just shows it is possible. And I think that when you have those ambitions, I think bringing people together and working with the willing, not the people that you really need to persuade really hard, because that wastes a lot of time. You know?
That's the drag of it all, right? Because it gets into politics and ideologies, right? And it's like, okay, we're going to go down that road now. Do you even believe in climate change? Let's start there.
Yeah. And that's the difference with the UK and the US. I think that there's no sort of debate around that.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. Climate change is real. I mean, we just saw this January has been 1.7 degrees hotter than the average. So we're already sort of shooting past 1.5. And I think a lot of people they don't have any time for the argument that climate change is or isn't happening. It's more like, how much do we prioritize it? Do we, you know, put all resources possible towards addressing it or not? And yeah, I guess it must be much more difficult for you guys that you have. It is a real sort of culture war around it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say most people, I don't know the numbers here now, believe that there is some impact, whether it's man-made or otherwise, but there is some those that still deny that it exists.
Yeah.
So we're a big country.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what was the most surprising for you in working on this project?
I think it's something I talked a bit about earlier, but it's about the fact that not much has been done in this area before. I think I was coming into it expecting not just on measurement, but I mean, there's just not a lot of concrete actions we could point to that have been evaluated and, you know, reported on, where the, you know, just transition had happened. We had that case, like I mentioned, that was just a couple of months ago after the report had actually been released. So there are things happening, but it's pretty sporadic. It's not that sort of systematic. There's quite a lot going on at EU level, which we kind of look at piningly and wish we were still in it. But the work at that level is very high level, sort of supranational level. And what we've had to develop is based on a lot of supposition, really, that, you know, we think that if you are more democratic, if you practice energy democracy, then it's going to probably lead to better outcomes. But there's no example of that really happening in a sort of long-term measured way. So we've had to make a lot of assumptions, which, you know, we were quite happy to do. In some ways, it's quite a creative thing, but it would be better to have the data. And I think the other really big...
You're creating the data is what's happening.
Well, yeah, hopefully we're sort of informing that. The other big surprise was that there was no really clear link between climate change and just transition. So we had a lot of debates around should we even measure environmental impacts of just transition or not as a sort of just transition outcome. And we had people in the commission who said, just delete it all. This is about justice. This is about, social justice, making sure vulnerable people are doing better. And the climate change stuff is kind of by the by. And others who are, this is a central purpose. This is why we're doing it. We're trying to get to to get to net zero. So we kind of had to innovate a bit there as well. And we ended up saying essentially that a co-benefit of just transition is more energy demand reduction. You're going to persuade people it's worth going to net zero, it's worth having a low carbon economy if it's not being unfair, unreasonable, punitive to certain groups who are always kind of downtrodden. So we did measure that, but we say it's not a direct reason for doing a just transition. That it's the byproduct, and it's a really, really important byproduct because we need to get there. But it is more about persuading people that it's not an unfair thing that is trying to happen.
Yeah, very interesting. So we will have the report for sure on our show notes. And I know that we can go to, how would people get directly to the report? Is there a website that they could learn more about this project?
For sure,
and do it themselves.
Yeah. On the Just Transition Commission website, they have a link to it. If you just Google the publications, it should be right there. We also are doing an international launch of the framework in springtime, so you kind of watch this space. Be happy to sort of publicize that, as we do think that there's a lot of international interest in this area. To do it at a national level is really tricky. We know that some countries are looking at that, including South Africa and Taiwan. I'm sure there's others. So we're really kind of trying to enter that space and kind of give a framework and example that people can work towards.
Love it. So you're hitting the road with this.
Hopefully. Exactly.
The Scotland Roadshow on a just transition.
Yeah.
All right. Are you coming to the U.S.?
I'd love to. Yeah. That'd be great.
Come here. We need you.
Yeah.
So, David, in closing, I want to ask this question.
Mm-hmm.
If you could make your mark in equity, in justice, in climate change, right? If the space that we're talking about, if you can make your mark that would leave a lasting legacy, what would that be?
So I'm always quite big on responsibilization. I love that word. It's a made-up word.
Responsibilization.
Yeah, making people responsible for stuff they should be responsible for. It's holding people to account. And I think that is hopefully the legacy of this work, that we're offering a way for governments to really take hold of this, to really kind of grab it by the reins and say, corporations are responsible for their workforces. Unions need to be part of this picture. If they've been involved and the outcomes are not so good, then they should also have some responsibility for that. And just kind of really going down the list of who needs to be doing these things. And without a sort of basic framework of, what should be achieved, what we're actually aiming at, what a successful just transition will look like, without that, I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can have accountability in the same way without that. So I really hope that that is one of the big results of this, and a real sort of lasting legacy.
Responsibility, accountability, right?
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. Right on. Spoken like a true researcher.
There you
Just
go.
saying. You got to get it. You got to prove it, and you got to show it works.
Yeah. Show it works. Hold them to account, and actually,
I love it. And
make some progress.
That's exactly that. This piece of metrics and accountability and measurements comes up in every show I do. It's so important right now, and it's so great that you've done a model that people can really use. And I'm going to look at it in a whole different eyes now after our interview today. So, David, thank you so much for coming on Just Power and sharing with us this groundbreaking work that you've done. So you must be so proud, and so many people will benefit. That will ripple on beyond even what you know about. So, right on. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Carolyn. Thanks for having me.
For coming on. And thank you for listening to Just Power. If you have a friend that would be interested in these topics, please share it, Just Power, with them. And if you love it, leave us a 5-star review on whatever your favorite place is, Apple or Spotify. We have a YouTube channel, wherever that is for you. Thank you again for coming on. And remember that the time is now to create a sustainable, reliable, affordable energy system that leaves no one behind. We are all in this together. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to Just Power wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really loved it, leave us a review and tell everyone you know about our podcast. It's going to take all of us to create a clean energy future that leaves no one behind.
The Just Power podcast is brought to you by New Mexico State University and Mind Over Markets, helping clean energy, clean tech, and regenerative businesses craft clear and compelling messaging that scales. Want to continue this conversation with Carolyn? Follow her on LinkedIn and follow the Just Power podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and on our YouTube channel. And for more intriguing conversations, follow New Mexico State University's microlearning social pages on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube.